The town of Millstone looked like something out of a postcard. Quaint streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and brick buildings lined with charming storefronts. Yet, beneath the surface of its picturesque facade lay an ugly truth. Millstone was a place where outsiders were barely tolerated, and black people were treated with suspicion, hostility, or worse. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The townsfolk carried their prejudices like unspoken rules, and the local police were its enforcers, ensuring that anyone who didn't fit in knew their place. Officer McKenna and his crew patrolled the streets like kings. On this particular afternoon, they leaned against their squad car outside the diner, laughing and swapping stories. Their latest tale involved a black motorist they had stopped for a busted taillight. The joke wasn't about the infraction. It was about how easily they could invent one. The diner regulars nodded along, complicit in the officer's sense of unchecked authority. Down the road, Samuel Cole drove into town in a beat-up sedan that blended in with the other cars on the highway. He wore a plain hoodie and jeans, his face set in a calm, unreadable expression. To anyone watching, he was just another traveler passing through. But Samuel had chosen Millstone deliberately. He was here on official FBI business, though he hadn't shared that fact with anyone. His mission was simple: investigate reports of racial profiling and police misconduct. What he didn't expect was the level of hostility that greeted him before he'd even parked his car. The motel receptionist barely made eye contact as she slid the room key across the counter. "You from around here?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. Samuel smiled politely. "Just passing through," he said, ignoring the way her lips tightened into a disapproving line. After dropping off his bag in the modest room, Samuel took a walk around town. The sun was bright, but the stares he received cast long shadows. At the hardware store, an older black man behind the counter greeted him with a wary nod. The man's name tag read Hargrove. They chatted briefly as Samuel purchased a flashlight and a pack of batteries. "You keep to yourself here?" Hargrove said, lowering his voice. "This place ain't kind of folks like us, especially with those cops running things." Samuel nodded, his face betraying none of his thoughts. "I appreciate the advice." Later that evening, Samuel stepped into the local diner for coffee. As he crossed the threshold, a hush fell over the room. The patrons glanced at him, then at each other, before returning to their meals with exaggerated disinterest. At a corner table, McKenna and two other officers stopped mid-conversation to stare openly at him. Their laughter resumed moments later, louder this time, as if to assert their dominance. Samuel ignored them, placing his order at the counter and taking a seat near the window. He sipped his coffee slowly, his ears tuned to the officers' crude remarks. They weren't subtle. "Guess we've got ourselves a tourist," one of them said loudly. "Hope he knows the rules." Samuel finished his coffee and left without a word, but he'd learned plenty in those few minutes. The hostility wasn't just casual. It was ingrained, a part of the town's fabric. It wasn't long before he realized that his mere presence was enough to stir the waters. Back at his motel room, Samuel reviewed the files he'd brought with him. Reports of fabricated charges, excessive force, and racial slurs painted a grim picture of the local police force. As he made notes, he received a text on his encrypted phone. "Stay sharp. Keep your cover." He typed back a quick acknowledgement before hiding the device beneath the mattress. Unbeknownst to Samuel, McKenna and his crew were already discussing him. The casual encounter at the diner had set off alarm bells in their heads. They didn't recognize him, and in a town like Millstone, strangers were treated with suspicion, especially ones who didn't belong. "We'll keep an eye on him," McKenna said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "If he steps out of line, we'll remind him where he is." As the sun set on Millstone, Samuel stood by the window of his motel room, watching the shadows grow longer. The quiet of the night was deceptive. He had come here to investigate, to expose the truth. But deep down, he knew that in a town like this, the truth wouldn't come without a fight. The morning in Millstone began quietly. The streets were bathed in a golden glow, the town seeming at peace on the surface. Samuel Cole, however, knew better. After a brief workout in his motel room, He grabbed his notebook and headed out to continue his investigation. The night before had only strengthened his resolve. The police's unchecked arrogance wasn't just troubling, it was dangerous. Samuel took his car and drove toward the outskirts of town, hoping to observe the police's behavior in less populated areas. He parked at the side of a narrow road and began taking notes about the neighborhoods, mostly dilapidated homes where the town's black residents lived, a stark contrast to the pristine center of Millstone. As he prepared to leave, a patrol car pulled up behind him. The blaring siren startled him for a moment before he calmed himself. He had expected this. The car doors slammed shut as Officer McKenna and his partner, Officer Travers, approached. McKenna wore a smug grin, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. Travers hung back, his eyes cold and calculating. "Morning," McKenna said, leaning against Samuel's car door. "Mind telling me what you're doing parked out here?" Samuel remained calm, his voice even. "Just taking in the sights. Is that a problem?" McKenna's grin widened. "Depends on what kind of sights you're taking in. Got ID on you?" Without hesitation, Samuel reached into his jacket and handed over his license. McKenna studied it, his grin fading slightly. "Samuel Cole. You don't look like you're from around here, Mr. Cole." "I'm not," Samuel replied. "Is there a law against visiting Millstone?" McKenna's expression hardened. "Not a law, but we don't take kindly to strangers poking around where they don't belong." Samuel's patience began to wear thin, but he kept his composure. "Am I being detained?" McKenna leaned in closer, his voice low. "You're asking a lot of questions for someone who's out of their element." Before Samuel could respond, Travers yanked open his car door. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked. Samuel hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. Fighting back wasn't an option. Not here, not yet. Slowly, he stepped out of the car, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "What's the problem?" Samuel asked evenly. "The problem," McKenna said, stepping forward, "is you're acting suspicious, and we don't like suspicious." Before Samuel could react, McKenna shoved him against the car. Floored, Travers moved in, pulling Samuel's arms behind his back. The cuffs snapped into place with an unnecessary amount of force. "Hey," Samuel protested. "This is unnecessary." McKenna ignored him, patting him down roughly. "Look at this," he said with a smirk, pulling a small notepad from Samuel's jacket. He flipped through it, his eyes narrowing. The pages were filled with observations about the town, notes on the police force, and even sketches of certain areas. "You taking notes on us, boy?" McKenna sneered. Travers chuckled darkly. "It's not illegal to take notes," Samuel said calmly, though his shoulders burned from the tight grip Travers had on him. "Well, it's illegal to resist arrest," McKenna snapped. Without warning, he drove his knee into Samuel's side, forcing him to double over. Samuel gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to cry out. The sound of a phone's camera shutter broke the tense silence. Across the street, a teenage black girl crouched behind a bush, her hands trembling as she recorded the scene on her phone. She recognized Samuel as the man who had smiled at her the day before outside the hardware store. Her breath hitched as she whispered, "They're gonna kill him." McKenna didn't notice her yet. He grabbed Samuel by the collar and dragged him toward the patrol car. "You like playing detective? Let's see how you like a night in our cells." Samuel was thrown into the back of the car, the cuffs biting into his wrists. His heartbeat remained steady despite the pain radiating from his ribs. He had been trained for situations like this, but it didn't make the experience any less humiliating. As the patrol car pulled away, the teenage girl ran down the road, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She had to find someone who would believe her, someone who could help. At the police station, Samuel was dragged inside like a trophy. McKenna and Travers exchanged smug grins with the other officers on duty as they booked Samuel. They made a show of searching his belongings, laughing loudly at his recording device, his phone, and his notes. "What's this?" McKenna asked mockingly, holding up the hidden recording device. "You think you're some kind of journalist?" Samuel stayed silent, his gaze steady. His lack of reaction seemed to infuriate McKenna, who slammed the device onto the table with unnecessary force. You're gonna sit tight until we figure out what to do with you, McKenna sneered. He gestured to another officer. Take him to the holding cell. As Samuel was led away, he finally spoke. You're making a mistake. McKenna laughed. The only mistake was you coming here in the first place. Samuel didn't respond. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Once inside the cell, he leaned against the wall, ignoring the dull ache in his ribs. He had memorized the layout of the station on the way in, and he knew exactly how this would end. That evening, in a quiet corner of town, the teenage girl showed her video to Mr. Hargrove, the shop owner. His hands trembled as he watched the footage. That's the man I spoke to yesterday, he murmured. He doesn't deserve this. The girl looked at him with wide, pleading eyes. What do we do? Hargrove hesitated. Going against the police in Millstone was dangerous. But as he watched the video again, seeing Samuel's calm demeanor and the officer's brutal aggression, he made a decision. We find someone who does, he said firmly. And so, the wheels of justice began to turn. The cell where Samuel was held was cold and damp, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly. He sat on the bench, his breathing calm, though every fiber of his body ached from the assault. Samuel's thoughts were clear and precise. He knew the moment was coming when his identity would be revealed, and he wanted every detail of this systemic injustice exposed before that happened. In the adjacent office, McKenna leaned back in his chair, a smug grin plastered on his face. Officer Travers was beside him, going through Samuel's confiscated belongings. This guy thought he could waltz into our town and play hero, McKenna said, laughing. We'll let him rot in that cell for a couple of days. Teach him a lesson. As Travers shuffled through the paperwork, he frowned, pulling out a sleek black badge that had been tucked inside Samuel's bag. It was embossed with the unmistakable emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Travers froze, his face draining of color. McKenna, Travers started, his voice trembling slightly. What is it now? McKenna asked, irritated by the interruption. Travers handed him the badge silently. As McKenna studied it, the smug grin melted from his face. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their actions settling over them like a storm cloud. This can't be real, McKenna said, his voice lower now, tinged with fear. But the badge was unmistakably authentic. The 2 men exchanged uneasy glances. Meanwhile, outside the station, the situation was quickly spiraling beyond their control. The teenage girl had uploaded her video online, and within hours it had gone viral. The footage of McKenna and Travers brutalizing Samuel spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #JusticeForSamuel and #ExposeMillstone began trending. Calls flooded the local mayor's office, the police department, and even regional news stations. In the modest home of Mr. Hargrove, a group of concerned townspeople gathered. The teenager had shown the video to more residents, and though many were afraid to act, a few courageous individuals joined her and Hargrove in planning their next steps. Among them was Grace Langston, a white schoolteacher who had always despised the town's bigotry, but had been too afraid to speak out. This video proves what we've known for years, Grace said, her voice steady. We can't stay silent anymore. This town's leadership has to answer for this. Hargrove nodded. It's not just about this one man. It's about the whole system. If we don't act now, nothing will ever change. Back at the station, McKenna and Travers scrambled to figure out their next move. The other officers in the building had caught wind of the badge and the brewing storm online. Tension filled the air as whispers spread among them. Even those who shared McKenna's prejudices began to feel the weight of impending consequences. You think he's really FBI? One officer asked nervously. Does it matter? Another replied. If he is, we're all screwed. As the officers argued, Samuel remained in his cell, his calm demeanor unnerving the rookie officer assigned to guard him. The young cop, Officer Bailey, approached the cell hesitantly. You're not really FBI, are you? Bailey asked, his voice shaking slightly. Samuel looked up, his gaze steady. I am. Bailey stepped back, the confirmation hitting him like a punch. Why didn't you just say something? Why let them? Because I needed the truth to come out, Samuel interrupted. And now it will. By midday, the pressure on the department became unbearable. A convoy of black SUVs pulled into Millstone, and agents in suits stepped out, their presence commanding immediate attention. Among them was Assistant Director Louise Carter, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for taking down corrupt institutions. Inside the station, McKenna's bravado crumbled as Carter strode into the building, flanked by agents. She ignored the officers who tried to stop her and headed straight for the holding cells. "Chief Cole," she said firmly, stopping in front of the cell. "Are you all right?" Samuel stood, his expression calm but firm. "I've been better." "Get this door open," Carter barked at Bailey, who fumbled with the keys before unlocking the cell. Samuel stepped out, stretching his sore wrists as the agents surrounded him protectively. McKenna, now pale and visibly sweating, tried to interject. "Ma'am, we didn't know who he was. This is a misunderstanding." Carter silenced him with a glare that could cut steel. "A misunderstanding? You assaulted a federal officer and unlawfully detained him. Do you have any idea how deep the trouble you're in goes?" Travers, now desperate, spoke up. He wasn't acting like an FBI agent. He was sneaking around, taking notes. Samuel turned to face them, his voice steady and authoritative. "I was investigating corruption and racial profiling within this department, and you just proved every allegation." As the agents secured evidence from the station, including Samuel's confiscated belongings and the surveillance footage, a crowd began to gather outside. News crews had arrived, their cameras trained on the building. Townspeople who had seen the viral video shouted for justice, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and determination. McKenna and Travers were handcuffed and escorted out of the station, their faces twisted with shame and defiance. The crowd erupted into cheers and jeers, some hurling insults while others simply recorded the moment on their phones. Inside, Carter debriefed Samuel. "The video's already out there. The Bureau's prepared to issue a statement, but I thought you'd want to address the town first." Samuel nodded. They deserved to hear the truth. Later that afternoon, Samuel stood on the steps of the station, facing the crowd. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust forward, but he didn't flinch. "My name is Samuel Cole," he began, his voice carrying over the noise. "I am the chief of the FBI, and I came to Millstone to investigate allegations of corruption and systemic racism within its police department. What I found was worse than I expected." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the countless people who've suffered in silence, who've been harassed, assaulted, or worse simply because of the color of their skin. This ends now." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers drowning out the murmurs of those still clinging to their prejudices. Samuel's words marked the beginning of a reckoning Millstone had avoided for far too long. And as the sun set on the once quiet town, its people stood at the edge of a long, painful journey toward justice and reconciliation. The town of Millstone was no longer the quiet, unassuming place it had been the day before. Overnight, it had become a national flashpoint. Protesters, journalists, and federal investigators flooded the streets. The video of Samuel Cole's brutal arrest had exposed not just the actions of a few corrupt officers, but the deep systemic rot that plagued the town. The community was polarized. Some supported the calls for justice, while others dug in, defending the police and the traditional values of Millstone. Inside the hastily erected FBI command center at the courthouse, Samuel Cole stood over a table littered with files, surveillance footage, and sworn testimonies from residents who had come forward. Assistant Director Carter entered the room, her face grave but resolute. "We've got enough to justify a federal takeover of the police department," she said, placing a stack of newly compiled evidence in front of Samuel. "But this isn't just about the department. The corruption runs deeper. Town officials, the mayor, maybe even the local businesses." Samuel nodded. "It's not just about accountability," he said, his voice firm. "We need to change the culture of this town. That won't happen with arrests alone." Carter raised an eyebrow. "You have a plan?" "I do," Samuel replied. "But it's going to take more than just the FBI. We need the community to stand with us." That morning, the FBI began executing search warrants across town. The police station was locked down as agents combed through files, computers, and evidence rooms. The findings were staggering. Records of falsified charges, evidence tampering, and even connections to hate groups. McKenna's office alone contained damning documents, including communications with local officials who had actively worked to suppress civil rights complaints. As the FBI's investigation unfolded, McKenna and Travers sat in interrogation rooms, their cocky demeanors replaced by visible fear. Special Agent Laura Hayes, a sharp and relentless interrogator, grilled McKenna for hours. "You knew exactly what you were doing," Hayes said, her tone icy. "You didn't just enforce the law, you weaponized it." McKenna sneered weakly. This town was fine before people started sticking their noses where they didn't belong. Hayes leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And now it's going to be fine without you." Outside, the mood was electric. Protesters marched through the streets, holding signs that read "Justice for Millstone" and "End Police Corruption Now." Grace Langston, the schoolteacher, stood on the steps of the library, addressing the growing crowd. "This town has lived in fear for too long," she said, her voice carrying over the chants. "But today, we have a chance to change that. Let's show the world that Millstone is more than its past. We can be better." Among the crowd were residents who had never dared to speak out before. Mr. Hargrove, the shop owner, held a sign that read "We stand with Samuel," while the teenage girl who filmed the video stood beside him, her face determined. Inside the mayor's office, the tension was palpable. Mayor Douglas Carter paced nervously as his phone rang off the hook. He had long benefited from the status quo, turning a blind eye to the police department's abuses in exchange for political support. Now, with the FBI breathing down his neck and the town in an uproar, his carefully crafted facade was crumbling. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, Samuel Cole stood there, flanked by two agents. "Mayor Carter," Samuel said, his voice calm but commanding. "We need to talk." The mayor tried to bluster. "Chief Cole, Samuel cut him off. "You've been complicit in everything that's happened here. The corruption, the racism, the violence. It all traces back to your office." The mayor's face turned red. "You have no proof?" "We have everything we need," Samuel interrupted. "You can either cooperate and help us rebuild this town, or you can go down with the rest of them. Your choice." Carter's shoulders sagged. He knew he was out of options. "What do you want from me?" he asked weakly. Samuel stepped closer. "A public statement condemning the actions of the police and pledging your full support for federal oversight. Then, you're going to resign." By midday, the news broke. Mayor Carter held a press conference, flanked by federal agents, where he admitted to his role in enabling the police department's abuses and announced his resignation. The crowd outside erupted into cheers and jeers, a mix of celebration and anger. At the same time, Samuel held a town hall meeting at the community center. Hundreds of residents packed the room, eager to voice their opinions and hear what came next. The atmosphere was tense as Samuel took the stage, his posture confident but approachable. "This isn't just about holding a few people accountable," Samuel began. "It's about rebuilding trust, about creating a town where everyone, no matter their race, background, or status, feels safe and respected." A man in the back shouted, "And what about the good cops? You're punishing them too." Samuel met the man's gaze. "Good cops don't stay silent when bad ones break the law. If they do, they're not good cops." The room fell silent for a moment before a smattering of applause began. It grew louder, spreading across the room like a wave. Samuel continued, "Change won't happen overnight, but it starts with all of us. We have to confront our biases, hold each other accountable, and demand better from our leaders." The meeting ended with a sense of cautious optimism. For the first time, residents felt like they had a voice. The FBI's presence would remain in Millstone for months to oversee the restructuring of the police department, but the true work was just beginning. As Samuel left the community center, Mr. Hargrove approached him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Samuel nodded. "Thank you for standing up. This town needs more people like you." That evening, as Samuel returned to his temporary headquarters, he looked out over the town. The protests had quieted for the night, and the streets were still. Change was coming to Millstone, not just through arrests and investigations, but through the people who had found their courage. Samuel knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, it felt possible. Millstone's reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. The transformation of Millstone was underway, but change did not come easily. As the FBI tightened its grip on the corrupt systems that had plagued the town, resistance grew louder and more aggressive. Samuel Cole, now fully visible as the leader of the reform effort, became both a symbol of hope and a target for backlash. Samuel began his morning reviewing the progress of the federal investigation. The evidence against the police department was overwhelming. Falsified records, racial profiling statistics, and connections to extremist groups were just the tip of the iceberg. Assistant Director Carter laid out a plan for further action. "We've identified a network of local officials and business owners who've supported this corruption," Carter said. "But they're already trying to cover their tracks." Samuel nodded. "Focus on the financials. Corruption leaves a trail." Carter hesitated. "There's something else. The backlash is escalating. We've intercepted threats against you." Samuel's expression didn't change. "I expected that. Let them come." The town was a battleground of ideologies. Protesters demanding justice and reform marched through the streets daily, their chants echoing through Millstone's once quiet neighborhoods. On the other side, counter-protesters gathered, waving flags and shouting slogans about defending tradition and protecting law and order. The divide wasn't just public. It crept into homes and relationships. At the local diner, Grace Langston overheard two men arguing over coffee. One was calling for accountability, while the other dismissed the protests as outsiders stirring up trouble. Grace couldn't stay silent. "It's not outsiders," she said, turning to them. "It's us. This is our mess to fix." The man scoffed. "And you think letting the feds take over is fixing it?" "It's better than ignoring it," Grace shot back. The tension was palpable, but her voice carried a conviction that silenced the room. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his outreach efforts. He visited schools, churches, and community groups, encouraging dialogue and listening to the residents' concerns. At one meeting, a young black boy raised his hand. "Mr. Cole," the boy asked hesitantly, "are the police going to stop hurting people like me?" The room fell silent. Samuel knelt to the boy's level, meeting his eyes. "That's why I'm here," he said, "to make sure they do." The boy's mother wiped tears from her eyes, and the audience erupted in applause. But not everyone welcomed Samuel's presence. Late one night, as Samuel worked in his motel room, a rock shattered his window. He looked out to see the taillights of a car speeding away. Attached to the rock was a note scrawled with the words, "Leave our town or else." Unfazed, Samuel calmly called the FBI security detail. "They're getting desperate," he said. The situation escalated further when a group of masked men set fire to a black-owned grocery store in town. The blaze consumed the small shop, leaving nothing but charred remains. The shop owner, Elaine Washington, was inconsolable as she watched her life's work reduced to ashes. Samuel arrived at the scene with agents, comforting Elaine while directing the investigation. "We'll find who did this," he promised, "and they'll answer for it." The arson galvanized the community. Protesters grew in number, their chants now demanding protection for vulnerable residents. The FBI increased its presence, and Samuel called a press conference to address the attack. "This is an act of cowardice," Samuel said, standing before the cameras, "but it will not deter us. We will rebuild, and we will hold those responsible accountable. Millstone will not go back to the way it was." Behind the scenes, McKenna and Travers, now in custody, watched the chaos unfold with bitter satisfaction. "They're tearing the town apart," McKenna muttered to his lawyer during a visitation. "All because of him." Travers, however, was more nervous. "They're not going to let us off easy," he said. "We're scapegoats now." "You made your choices," the lawyer said flatly. "You're going to pay for them." As tensions reached a boiling point, Samuel organized a town-wide forum, inviting residents from all sides to share their views. The event, held in the high school gymnasium, was packed. The atmosphere was tense, with community members seated on opposite sides of the room, divided like opposing teams. Samuel stood at the center, flanked by FBI agents. "This town is at a crossroads," he began. We can either face our problems head-on, or we can let them destroy us. A man stood up, his face red with anger. "You're the problem," he shouted. "You came here and brought all this chaos with you." Samuel met the man's glare. "The chaos was already here. I just exposed it." Another resident, an elderly black woman named Mrs. Jenkins, spoke up next. "I've lived in this town my whole life," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I've seen how people like me are treated. This isn't chaos, it's justice." Her words resonated, and applause broke out among her supporters. The forum continued for hours, with residents venting their frustrations, sharing their fears, and, for the first time in decades, truly listening to one another. By the end of the night, Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. The forum hadn't solved all of Millstone's problems, but it was a start. As he left the gymnasium, Grace Langston approached him. "You're doing something incredible here," she said, "but be careful. The people who don't want change, they're not going to go quietly." "I know," Samuel replied, "but neither am I." As Samuel returned to his room that night, the town seemed quieter than it had in days. But he knew the calm was temporary. The battle for Millstone's soul was far from over, and the hardest fights were yet to come. Millstone woke to an uneasy silence. The protests had continued into the night, but the fiery passion of the town's residents had begun to shift into something darker. Rumors swirled of armed groups forming to defend Millstone's traditions, while whispers of outside activists pouring in to support Samuel Cole's efforts further inflamed tensions. The FBI was on high alert, and Samuel knew that the most dangerous confrontation was imminent. The morning began with another attack. The local church, historically attended by Millstone's black residents, was vandalized overnight. Racist slurs were spray-painted across its walls, and the windows had been smashed. The sight of the desecrated building brought tears to the eyes of Reverend Harold Bryant, who had been preaching there for 30 years. Samuel arrived at the scene shortly after the news broke. Standing with Reverend Bryant, he examined the graffiti, the red and black paint, a visceral reminder of the hatred they were up against. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on the Reverend's shoulder. "We'll find who did this," he said firmly. Reverend Bryant nodded, his face etched with determination. "This isn't the first time they've tried to silence us," he said, "and it won't be the last, but we'll endure." That afternoon, Samuel convened his team of FBI agents to assess the situation. Assistant Director Carter was grim. "The vandalism is just the beginning," she said, laying out reports of growing hostility from French groups in and around Millstone. "We've intercepted chatter suggesting an organized effort to disrupt your work here." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "We need to secure the community before this escalates further. Increase patrols around vulnerable areas, businesses, churches, homes." "And you?" Carter asked. "You're the primary target." "I'm not backing down," Samuel said, his voice steady. "As they're coming for me, let them. It'll give us the evidence we need to shut them down for good." The tension reached a boiling point that evening during a town hall meeting meant to address the recent attacks. Held in the high school gymnasium, the event was packed with residents, protesters, and media. Samuel stood at the podium, flanked by his agents, while rows of angry faces stared back at him. "We're here to discuss a path forward," Samuel began, his voice calm but authoritative. "This town has suffered from division and hatred for too long. It's time for accountability and reconciliation." A man in the audience stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "You mean it's time to destroy everything this town stands for?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the gym. "We don't need outsiders telling us how to live." Before Samuel could respond, Grace Langston, the schoolteacher, stood up. "What this town needs is justice," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "We've ignored this problem for too long, and now it's tearing us apart." The room erupted into chaos. People shouted over one another, their voices a cacophony of rage and desperation. Samuel raised his hands, calling for calm, but the tension was too thick to break. Then, from the back of the room, a booming voice yelled, "You're not welcome here, Cole." A bottle flew through the air, shattering against the podium. Gasps rippled through the crowd as FBI agents moved quickly to shield Samuel. Outside the gym, the situation spiraled further out of control. A group of counter-protesters, armed with bats and makeshift shields, clashed with protesters calling for justice. The sound of shouting, breaking glass, and scuffling feet filled the air as the two sides collided. Samuel and his team emerged from the gym to see the chaos unfolding. "Disperse the crowd," Samuel ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. The agents moved quickly, using their presence to de-escalate the situation. Local police, still under FBI oversight, reluctantly assisted, their authority under question by all sides. Amid the chaos, Samuel spotted the teenage girl who had filmed his assault months earlier. She was clutching her phone, recording the violence around her. A man in the crowd spotted her and lunged toward her, shouting slurs. Samuel moved instinctively, stepping between them and defusing the confrontation. "You're brave," Samuel said to her, his voice steady despite the tension. "But be careful." By the time the streets calmed, Millstone was on edge. The media painted a grim picture of a town on the brink, and the pressure on Samuel and the FBI grew exponentially. In the command center, Assistant Director Carter confronted Samuel. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "We can't protect the entire town." Samuel nodded, exhaustion evident on his face. "We're not here to protect them from each other. We're here to expose the truth. And we're close." That night, Samuel received an anonymous tip. A local militia group, calling themselves the Millstone Defenders, had planned a meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The tipster claimed the group was armed and preparing to launch an attack on FBI assets in the area. Samuel gathered his team and formulated a plan. "We're going to hit them before they hit us," he said. "But we need to be smart. No unnecessary violence." The agents moved swiftly, descending on the warehouse under the cover of darkness. Inside, they found a cache of weapons, propaganda materials, and a group of men discussing their next move. The raid was quick and efficient, and the group was taken into custody without incident. The arrest sent shockwaves through the town. The media seized on the story, painting the raid as a decisive blow against the forces of hate in Millstone. But Samuel knew this was just one battle in a larger war. The next morning, Samuel addressed the town again, this time from the steps of the courthouse. "Last night, we stopped a violent plot that could have destroyed lives," he said. "But this isn't just about a few bad actors. It's about changing the culture that allowed them to thrive." As he spoke, the crowd listened in silence. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked away, their expressions a mix of shame and defiance. Samuel continued, "Change isn't easy, and it's not comfortable, but it's necessary. And if we're willing to face the truth, Millstone can become a place where everyone is safe, valued, and free." The speech marked a turning point. The arrest had weakened the opposition, and more residents began to voice their support for Samuel's efforts. But as the sun set over Millstone, Samuel knew the fight wasn't over. The forces of hate were wounded, but not defeated. And the path to justice would be long and fraught with challenges. The fallout from the militia raid set Millstone on a knife's edge. The arrest had exposed the deep ties between the town's elite and the violent undercurrent that had terrorized its marginalized communities for decades. Samuel Cole had become both a savior and a lightning rod, his actions polarizing the town even further. Tension simmered, and Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before they boiled over. The morning began with Samuel reviewing new evidence uncovered from the raid. Assistant Director Carter placed a folder on his desk, her expression grim. "We found financial records linking the militia to several prominent figures in town," she said. "Business owners, a judge, even members of the town council. They've been funding and protecting these extremists for years." Samuel flipped through the documents. "This isn't just corruption. It's a conspiracy." Carter nodded. "And if we go after them, the backlash will be massive." "We don't have a choice," Samuel replied. "If we let this slide, the system will never change." Meanwhile, in the heart of town, the community was reeling from the revelations. The local diner buzzed with whispers as residents debated the arrests and the looming investigation. Grace Langston, the schoolteacher, overheard a heated conversation at the counter. "This is a witch hunt," one man said, slamming his coffee cup down. "They're trying to destroy this town." Grace turned to him, her voice steady but firm. "The only thing being destroyed is the hate that's been allowed to fester here." The man glared at her. "Easy for you to say. You're siding with them." "I'm siding with what's right," Grace shot back. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. That afternoon, Samuel organized a meeting with a coalition of local leaders, activists, pastors, and business owners who supported the reform efforts. The group gathered in the community center, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension. "We're making progress," Samuel began, addressing the group. "But progress comes with resistance. We need to stay united, especially now." Reverend Bryant spoke up, his voice resonating through the room. "The people need to see that change is possible, but they also need protection. The attacks on the church and the store show that the opposition is getting desperate." Samuel nodded. "The FBI is increasing patrols, but we need the community to stand together. Fear is their weapon, and unity is ours." That evening, the backlash reached a terrifying new level. A group of masked men attacked a peaceful protest outside the courthouse, hurling rocks and fireworks into the crowd. Chaos erupted as protesters scattered, and FBI agents scrambled to regain control. Samuel arrived on the scene moments later, his heart sinking at the sight of injured protesters and shattered windows. He knelt beside a young woman clutching her arm, blood seeping through her sleeve. "You're going to be okay," Samuel said, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. He called for medics, his mind racing with anger and determination. Back at the FBI command center, Samuel met with his team to assess the situation. Carter's face was etched with frustration. "This was coordinated," she said. "The same group we arrested is likely behind this, working through their remaining contacts." Samuel clenched his fists. "We can't just react anymore. We need to go on the offensive." The next day, the FBI launched a series of raids across Millstone, targeting the financial backers of the militia and corrupt officials within the town government. The operation was swift and surgical, with agents seizing documents, computers, and other evidence from homes and offices. One of the arrests was particularly significant. Judge William Hanley, a longtime pillar of the community, was taken into custody for funneling money to extremist groups and obstructing investigations into police misconduct. As Hanley was led away in handcuffs, reporters swarmed the scene, their cameras capturing every moment. Samuel watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. "Taking down someone like him sends a message," Carter said, standing beside him. "It's not enough," Samuel replied. "We need to dismantle the whole system." The arrest sent shockwaves through the town. The media seized on the story, painting the raid as a decisive blow against the forces of hate in Millstone. But Samuel knew this was just one battle in a larger war. The next morning, Samuel addressed the town again, this time from the steps of the courthouse. "Last night, we stopped a violent plot that could have destroyed lives," he said. "But this isn't just about a few bad actors. It's about changing the culture that allowed them to thrive." As he spoke, the crowd listened in silence. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked away, their expressions a mix of shame and defiance. Samuel continued, "Change isn't easy, and it's not comfortable, but it's necessary. And if we're willing to face the truth, Millstone can become a place where everyone is safe, valued, and free." The speech marked a turning point. The arrest had weakened the opposition, and more residents began to voice their support for Samuel's efforts. But as the sun set over Millstone, Samuel knew the fight wasn't over. The forces of hate were wounded, but not defeated. And the path to justice would be long and fraught with challenges. The fallout from the militia raid set Millstone on a knife's edge. The arrest had exposed the deep ties between the town's elite and the violent undercurrent that had terrorized its marginalized communities for decades. Samuel Cole had become both a savior and a lightning rod, his actions polarizing the town even further. Tension simmered, and Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before they boiled over. The morning began with Samuel reviewing new evidence uncovered from the raid. Assistant Director Carter placed a folder on his desk, her expression grim. "We found financial records linking the militia to several prominent figures in town," she said. Business owners, a judge, even members of the town council. They've been funding and protecting these extremists for years. Samuel flipped through the documents. This isn't just corruption. It's a conspiracy. Carter nodded. And if we go after them, the backlash will be massive. We don't have a choice, Samuel replied. If we let this slide, the system will never change. Meanwhile, in the heart of town, the community was reeling from the revelations. The local diner buzzed with whispers as residents debated the arrests in the looming investigation. Grace Langston, the schoolteacher, overheard a heated conversation at the counter. "This is a witch hunt," one man said, slamming his coffee cup down. "They're trying to destroy this town." Grace turned to him, her voice steady but firm. "The only thing being destroyed is the hate that's been allowed to fester here." The man glared at her. "Easy for you to say. You're siding with them." "I'm siding with what's right," Grace shot back. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. That afternoon, Samuel organized a meeting with a coalition of local leaders, activists, pastors, and business owners who supported the reform efforts. The group gathered in the community center, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension. "We're making progress," Samuel began, addressing the group. "But progress comes with resistance. We need to stay united, especially now." Reverend Bryant spoke up, his voice resonating through the room. "The people need to see that change is possible, but they also need protection. The attacks on the church and the stores show that the opposition is getting desperate." Samuel nodded. "The FBI is increasing patrols, but we need the community to stand together. Fear is their weapon, and unity is ours." That evening, the backlash reached a terrifying new level. A group of masked men attacked a peaceful protest outside the courthouse, hurling rocks and fireworks into the crowd. Chaos erupted as protesters scattered, and FBI agents scrambled to regain control. Samuel arrived on the scene moments later, his heart sinking at the sight of injured protesters and shattered windows. He knelt beside a young woman clutching her arm, blood seeping through her sleeve. "You're going to be okay," Samuel said, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. He called for medics, his mind racing with anger and determination. Back at the FBI command center, Samuel met with his team to assess the situation. Carter's face was etched with frustration. "This was coordinated," she said. "The same group we arrested is likely behind this, working through their remaining contacts." Samuel clenched his fists. "We can't just react anymore. We need to go on the offensive." The next day, the FBI launched a series of raids across Millstone, targeting the financial backers of the militia and corrupt officials within the town government. The operation was swift and surgical, with agents seizing documents, computers, and other evidence from homes and offices. One of the arrests was particularly significant. Judge William Hanley, a longtime pillar of the community, was taken into custody for funneling money to extremist groups and obstructing investigations into police misconduct. As Hanley was led away in handcuffs, reporters swarmed the scene, their cameras capturing every moment. Samuel watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. "Taking down someone like him sends a message," Carter said, standing beside him. "It's not enough," Samuel replied. "We need to dismantle the whole system." The arrest sent shockwaves through the town. Supporters of reform cheered the FBI's actions, while opponents grew more vocal and defiant. Protests and counter-protests became daily occurrences, with tensions threatening to erupt into full-blown violence. In a desperate move, a coalition of town leaders who opposed Samuel's efforts called for his removal. They held a press conference, accusing him of overreach and painting the FBI as invaders who were destroying Millstone's way of life. Samuel responded with his own press conference. Standing on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by FBI agents and community leaders, he spoke directly to the people of Millstone. "I didn't come here to destroy this town," Samuel said, his voice firm but measured. "I came here to save it, from hate, from corruption, and from itself. Change is hard, but it's necessary. And if we're willing to face the truth, Millstone can become a better place for everyone." His words struck a chord with many, but others remained unconvinced. The divide in Millstone deepened, with some residents calling for unity and others doubling down on their resistance. As night fell, Samuel returned to his motel room, exhausted but resolute. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Samuel opened it to find Grace Langston standing there, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. She played a video showing a group of masked men gathered in a dark barn, their faces illuminated by the glow of a fire. They were armed, and their leader spoke with venom. "Tomorrow, we take back our town. No more protests. No more outsiders. We end this." Samuel's expression hardened. "Call the team," he said to Grace. "We're ending this tonight." The air in Millstone was thick with tension as Samuel Cole and his FBI team prepared for what could be the decisive moment in their mission. The video Grace Langston had shown him, a call to arms from the militia remnants, confirmed Samuel's worst fears. A violent uprising was imminent. This wasn't just about hate, it was about control. The militia and their supporters were determined to wrest Millstone from Samuel's grasp, even if it meant bloodshed. Samuel stood in the FBI's mobile command center, staring at a map of Millstone and its surrounding areas. The barn from the video had been identified, a secluded structure hidden in the woods, far from prying eyes. The intelligence team confirmed the presence of at least a dozen armed men inside. Assistant Director Carter, standing beside him, was visibly concerned. "We can't afford to wait," Carter said. "They're planning something big, and if they strike first, we'll lose control of the situation." Samuel nodded, his jaw set. "We move tonight, but no unnecessary force. I want every one of them alive. They'll answer for this in court, not the streets." By nightfall, the FBI had mobilized. Black SUVs rolled through the quiet roads of Millstone, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Samuel rode in the lead vehicle, mentally reviewing the plan. The team would surround the barn, cut off escape routes, and use non-lethal measures to subdue the militia members. It was a delicate operation, requiring precision and restraint. The agents reached the outskirts of the barn just before midnight. They moved silently through the woods, their dark uniforms blending into the shadows. As they drew closer, Samuel spotted the barn through the trees. The faint glow of firelight seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls, and the muffled sound of voices carried on the wind. Samuel raised a fist, signaling the team to halt. He spoke into his radio. "Positions? North and south covered," came one agent's voice. "He's secured," another confirmed. Samuel took a deep breath. "Execute." The FBI agents moved swiftly, surrounding the barn in seconds. Using loudspeakers, they announced their presence. "This is the FBI. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." Inside the barn, chaos erupted. The militia members scrambled, grabbing their guns and shouting orders at one another. Their leader, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, barked commands. "Hold your ground. They're not taking us alive." Samuel listened to the commotion from his position outside, his heart pounding. He raised his voice over the loudspeaker. "No one needs to die tonight. Surrender now, and you'll have your day in court. Resist, and you'll face the full weight of the law." A single gunshot cracked through the night, shattering the tense silence. Samuel ducked instinctively as the bullet ricocheted off the SUV behind him. The agents immediately returned fire, aiming for non-lethal suppression. Inside the barn, the militia's leader rallied his men, but the FBI's tactical precision was overwhelming. Tear gas canisters shattered through the barn's windows, filling the air with a choking fog. One by one, militia members stumbled out, coughing and disoriented, their hands raised. But the leader refused to surrender. He grabbed an automatic rifle and fired wildly, determined to go down fighting. Samuel, seeing the escalation, made a decision. "Cover me," he ordered, grabbing a shield and moving toward the barn. Carter's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Samuel, don't do this." "I have to," Samuel replied. Samuel entered the barn cautiously, his shield raised. The tear gas stung his eyes, but he pressed forward. He spotted the leader crouched behind an overturned table, the rifle shaking in his hands. "It's over," Samuel shouted. "Drop the weapon." The man sneered. You think you can come here and destroy everything we stand for? I'd rather die than give up." Samuel stepped closer, his voice calm but commanding. "What you stand for is fear and hate. But look around. You've already lost. Your men are outside in cuffs. It's just you now. Don't make this worse." For a moment, the man hesitated, his grip on the rifle faltering. Samuel seized the opportunity. "Put the gun down, and you'll live to see another day. Fight, and this ends here." The man's shoulders slumped. He dropped the rifle and raised his hands. Samuel moved quickly, cuffing him and leading him out of the barn. Outside, the remaining militia members had been subdued. As the leader was escorted to an FBI vehicle, he glared at Samuel. "This isn't over," he spat. "There are more of us out there. You'll never win." Samuel met his gaze, unflinching. Justice always wins. The operation was a success, but Samuel knew the night's events would leave lasting scars on Millstone. The arrests of the militia members were broadcast nationwide, drawing both praise and condemnation. The town was now at a crossroads, its future hanging in the balance. The next day, Samuel stood before a crowd in Millstone's town square, addressing the community. Residents of all races and backgrounds had gathered, their faces a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Last night, we stopped an act of terror," Samuel began, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about what happened in that barn. It's about what's been happening in this town for generations. Hate has no place here, or anywhere, and it's up to all of us to ensure it never returns." The crowd erupted into applause, though some faces remained skeptical. Samuel knew not everyone would be swayed, but the tide was turning. In the aftermath, the FBI's presence in Millstone began to wane as local leaders stepped up to rebuild trust and unity. Grace Langston spearheaded a community initiative to address systemic racism, while Reverend Bryant worked to heal the town's divisions through open dialogue and outreach programs. Samuel prepared to leave Millstone, his mission complete. As he packed his things, Mr. Hargrove, the shop owner, stopped by to thank him. "You gave us hope," Hargrove said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll carry it from here." Samuel smiled. "That's all I wanted." As he drove out of Millstone, Samuel reflected on the journey. The town still had a long way to go, but it was on the right path. And for the first time in years, the sun rising over Millstone felt like the dawn of a new chapter.